Welcome, brave souls, to Fear File Chronicles, your one-way ticket to spine-chilling stories and terrifying tales. Tonight, we'll be diving into the darkest corners of the human mind with the story, After the Fall, Part 9, penned by the twisted mind of Locked 334. Together, we'll explore the unexplained and face our deepest fears. But before we begin, if you enjoy trembling in terror, be sure to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fear fanatics, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click the bell notification so you never miss an eerie episode. Your support truly means the world to us, so feel free to leave a comment below to join the Fear File Chronicles community. Now, without further ado, let's unravel the mysteries of the unknown together as we delve into tonight's fear-inducing story, After the Fall. Part 9. Dim the lights and prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the Fear File Chronicles. The following day, the entire group was called to speak to General Foreman, one at a time. They were questioned about the events of the previous night and told not to repeat them to another soldier. Tony and Duke sat outside the office, waiting their turn, unsure of what they would be asked. Duke considered asking Tony if he was going to be all right, but the blank stare that still hung on the boy's face made him second-guess it. Tony sat emotionless, while Duke disappeared into the general's office. He sat thinking of the blood and of Apache's body. Then he thought about how it felt to kill again. It reminded him of Colin and how small it made him feel. His name being called broke him from his dream as Duke passed by without even looking at him.
Specialist Stone,
Foreman said as Tony took a seat.
I'm sure you know why you are here.
Yes, sir, I do.
The boy answered, staring at the wall behind the man.
What happened exactly?
Foreman asked, while scribbling notes and staring at his papers. Tony relayed the story for the general, his eyes not leaving the whitewashed wall, barely even blinking. The words told each step he had made and what he had witnessed. It played on repeat in his head as he spoke, his body shaking when he began detailing Apache's body. Then, when mentioned killing, he would look to his hands. They still felt dirty. In his mind, he could still see the blood staining it. When he was finished, he sat staring at his hands. The general finished writing and took notice. The room was quiet for some time, neither of them sure what to say at first.
How could this have happened?
We call them vultures. It's one of the things we are fighting against out there.
Foreman sighed.
How did they even know we would be out there?
Tony's eyes became wild and turned directly at the general. Foreman turned in his chair, stood and walked around the desk. He sat on the edge of it, and for a moment just looked at Tony. He shook his head, trying to decide what to say. There were a lot of things in this world that had changed, but he was still having trouble understanding it himself. When he was sure of the right words and how to say them, he gave another sigh and slid the folder across the desk. Tony looked down to see images of two men in Apex Predator uniforms, one of which looked familiar. He looked closer, and his eyes grew wide, remembering the man who was carving into Apache.
We've discovered that some of those vultures have found their way into our ranks,
Foreman said with a frown.
Wait, you mean...
Tony shook his head.
No, not in here too.
Not anymore. You took care of that.
Foreman rested his hand on Boy's shoulder. Tony pulled away.
How do you know there isn't more?
The general stood and went back to his seat, pulled the folder back to him and said,
That's why I asked you here, Stone.
It took the next year for their small unit to uncover the wolves among them, but with the general's help, they did. There had been 6 charged with molestation, 4 for rape, and 3 more groups killing their younger counterparts. They only found 1 more instance of cannibalism, but it was enough. With each mission, Tony became harder. He was becoming the wolf that stalked in the night, and his pack grew strong. At the end of that year, each member of their group was promoted to corporal, and B Company had been nicknamed the Night Stalkers. Where their individual strength was lacking, they made up for with teamwork. No one dared cross them in packs. and it was not long before they received their first mission outside their usual scouting grounds. They would be sent south, back across the border. Tony would be going back to Pembina, North Dakota, for the first time in over 2 years, and he immediately thought of a tiny inscription over a shallow grave. Like usual, the group set out at night. Buzzkill had been requested to drive them by jeep to the border, where they set out on foot. They moved quietly through the overgrown field, the brush higher than their crouched bodies. The moon overhead guided their movements as they approached a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Pembina. Tony recognized the place. He had passed it not long before being taken by the predators. His eyes scanned the field, especially further south. There stood the decrepit tree, a monument to his past. He tapped Duke on the shoulder and pointed to it, signaling to head that way. The group came to rest under the tree, several of the boys taking an opportunity to check their gear, grab a gulp of water, or check their map. Duke hovered over one of them, staring down at the map and asking questions of the designated target. Tony stood by the tree, running his fingers along Colin's name. It took a few minutes for Duke to notice, but he approached and placed a hand on Tony's shoulder.
"You okay?"
Duke asked, his brows curving in concern.
Yeah, just saying hello to an old friend.
Tony smiled slightly.
What?"
The older of the two said, confused.
Remember I told you I had help getting all the way here?
"Well, yeah, but that's about all you ever really told me."
This is where he died.
Tony waved his hands around to the clearing.
So, this is where I buried him.
"Oh."
Duke shuffled his feet and looked down before coming closer, noticing the name in the tree.
"Colin?"
Yeah, he was like a brother to me. I wouldn't have made it here if it weren't for him.
Tony sighed, a tear forming at the edge of his eye.
"Funny."
Duke laughed slightly. Why's that?
Tony turned to look at him.
"I had a brother named Colin,"
Duke said while smiling, his eyes trailing off in a memory. Tony found himself staring at Duke, shocked by what he had heard. What were the odds? He stared harder, and soon Duke noticed. Duke squinted again, asking if his friend was okay. Tony simply knelt down and removed his pack. A small compartment on the side was opened, and Tony revealed a tattered old Bible. Between the pages, he found what he was looking for, a yellowed and worn picture of a family. There was a mother, father, and 2 very young boys. He tucked the Bible under his arm and stepped to Duke, handing him the picture. Duke's eyes narrowed as he attempted to see the image in the dark. But soon he realized what he was looking at. His thumb trailed over the young image of his mother and the smiling face of his father. He laughed slightly at seeing his chubby cheeks as a tiny boy, and when he saw Colin, the tears began to roll down his cheeks. Tony brushed a tear away as well and stepped back to the tree. He knelt there over Colin's grave, holding the Bible and looking at Duke.
"How?"
I have no idea. He thought you were dead.
Tony said in a quiet tone of remembrance.
"So, he's buried here."
Tony nodded.
Yeah, he died protecting me, and I couldn't just leave him out here to be picked at by the animals. He wouldn't have done that to me.
Duke knelt by the makeshift grave, his hand touching the ground. Salty specks littered the dirt as they both sat quietly. The rest of the group had noticed the exchange but decided to stay out of it. Tony then leaned over, pushing the Bible toward Duke. He told him it had been Colin's, and he knew that his brother would want him to have it. Duke took the worn book from Tony, his fingers pressing it open and scanning through the pages. The ink was faded, but he could still read some of the scriptures. The front still had his brother's name written in it, and he remembered when his grandmother had gifted them both one. Duke's hands flipped to the back pages, which had been left blank for writing notes. He found a letter addressed to him in his brother's handwriting.
Danny, if I don't see you again and you're reading this, I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you better. I spent the last few months so sure you were dead. Then, I found Tony. He gave me hope to find you again. He has become like a brother to me. He reminds me so much of you. He could never replace you, but it made it easier out here without you. If you find him with this book, stay close to him. He can't replace me either, but I promise you, you won't regret meeting him. Take care of each other. Survive. And remember, I will always love you. Your big brother, Colin.
Duke tucked the Bible in his pack and gave Tony a hug. Their group turned away, and Weasel started asking about the mission to try to change the subject. Tony stepped away, patting Duke on the back. He nodded to him to say it would be all right, and promised they could talk more once the mission was done. Duke agreed, and they stepped back to the group. Weasel had pointed out the path they would take that led to the farmhouse ahead. It sat just on the edge of the property, and according to their sources, a group of murderous scavengers had taken up residence in it. According to General Foreman, this is where most of the vultures had come from recently. The radio keyed up. A message came through from Overwatch Group requesting position of the Night Stalkers. Tony touched at his ear before identifying himself and informing them of their position. They were asked for confirmation of go status. Tony looked to the group, who nodded in agreement. Tony gave the confirmation as they all readied their weapons. The group moved toward the farmhouse as a larger group waited on the hill behind the house. Overwatch was made up of a more experienced adult group, which had been instructed to observe and assist. This was their first sanctioned mission outside the wall and would determine their future within the apex predators. Tet observed from the back with binoculars, calling out targets appearing through the windows. There had been 2 armed men standing on the front porch, 3 inside that appeared to be drinking an unidentified motion within one of the upstairs windows. The group advanced. Duke took Wheeler to flank left, while Tony, Weasel, and Tech moved right. They approached from the tall grass, stopping just at the edge. The 2 men outside seemed to be having a discussion, which might take some time. They would not be able to enter through the front without being spotted.
It's not like it's going to matter anyway.
One of the men said.
What do you mean?
The other replied.
You know we're all going to be speaking Spanish soon?
That's just a rumor. The Mexicans aren't gonna come all the way up here.
Either way, I'm going to have as much fun as I can before then.
Tony had no idea what they meant, but he made a note to ask the general when they returned. He looked across the field to Duke, who was signaling for him to take his group around back to find an entrance. He motioned with his hand a confirmation, then pointed to his right. The group followed behind him closely with their weapons at the ready. They moved in a staggered formation, slipping through the brush until they reached the backyard. The grass had not been kept cut, which allowed them to draw closer to the rear entrance. The steps were broken and the door appeared to be boarded shut. They would not be able to enter without making a lot of noise. Weasel tapped Tony on the shoulder and pointed to 2 large doors that led downward. They could only assume it led to some sort of cellar, which would be their best bet. Tech fished for his lock-picking set and started work on the fastened chain that held the doors closed. The boys eased the doors open, deafening the creak the old wood would make. They entered one at a time, descending into darkness. Their feet met concrete steps that dropped below floor level toward a dirt floor. Each flashlight attached to their rifles flickered to life, and they took the room in sweeping formation. The interior was only half that of the upper floors, surrounded by a cinder block foundation. Wooden shelves lined the room with glass jars of varying size. Weasel approached, his light refracting through the liquid inside. It revealed a fleshy mass that had once been a human foot, floating in some sort of preservative. Weasel's eyes widened once he realized what was in front of him. When Tony noticed this, he clasped his hand over the boy's mouth. Tony shook his head and raised a finger to his mouth. They could not afford to be heard before they knew what was waiting upstairs. Tony radioed the rest of the group to inform them that his group had made it inside. After receiving confirmation, the group continued to search the room for an entry into the home. Among the jars were various body parts, but what was most disturbing was the intact body of a fetus. Tony stared at this particular specimen for several minutes, unable to understand why anyone would do this. Tet's flashlight waved side to side to draw their attention to a ladder. The rungs ended at a hatch in the ceiling. Tony motioned for his squad mate to go up, then pointed to his eyes to give an order to look around. Tech slid his rifle over his shoulder and started to ascend. Once he reached the hatch, he gave it a slight push. To his surprise, it moved, so he reached into his pocket to reveal a small mirror. The hatch raised slightly, and with the mirror, he circled the space. It appeared to exit into a pantry full of more jars, so he finished opening the hatch. Once Tech gave the all clear, the other two joined him in the cramped pantry. Tony took the mirror and slid it under the edge of the pantry door. The other side held a kitchen with a large butcher block table in the center. The wood was still stained from the last use, which caused Tony's dinner to try to exit his throat. He held it back and swallowed, gagging at the taste. He relayed what he saw to prepare his group for what they would see next as he reached for the handle. Tony allowed the door to part just enough to see out and notice the hallway that led to the living room. The door swung open slowly, Tony's rifle rising as he exited. Weasel followed just behind, scanning the area to the rear of Tony. Tech was last, pushing the door back behind him and crossing the kitchen. Various cutting tools had been scattered across the kitchen counter, and the sink was still specked with blood and viscera. Tech covered his mouth and nose to try to block out the odor, but it was too powerful. The kitchen was tiny, and the back door was all that lay behind them. They had but one direction to go, and that was toward the living room. Each area was dimly lit with candles and oil lanterns, and the light danced along the walls. This only added to the sense of paranoia that grew in the young soldiers. They knew that at any corner they could be met with a fight. Tony held up his hand to signal the group to stop as he approached a doorway to his left. All of them could hear the men in the living room talking now, but they had to check each room as they passed. The leader's rifle made the corner of the door with Weasel just behind. It had once been a bedroom, but now resembled a torture chamber. The bed had been fitted with chains that currently held the lifeless body of a young woman. Tony checked her pulse to verify what his mind already knew to be true. He pulled the sheet over her cold and naked body. It was the best he could do for her now. They exited back into the hall and switched to the opposite wall in order to approach the next doorway. The passage was shut, so again Tony used the mirror to judge what may be on the other side. When he stood, he could only look back and shake his head. His hand grasped the knob carefully, turning it as slowly as possible. The light from the hall spilled into a tiny closet where another woman sat bound and gagged within. The woman's eyes grew wide and began shaking at the sight of the boys. Tony could only imagine she thought they were there to hurt her.
We are not here to hurt you. We're gonna get you out of here, okay?
The woman nodded as if she understood, tears filling her eyes as Tony helped her to her feet. He ordered Weasel to escort her back to the cellar and away from the house. Weasel took the woman by the hand and headed back to the pantry door. Tony whispered into his radio for assistance. Duke responded. Once he was aware of the situation, he took Weasel's place in the group. They stood silent in the hall. The stairs leading up were to their left and the doorway to the living room was right ahead. They could not risk alerting the men in the living room, but had no idea what lay in store above them. Tony pointed to the living room and moved forward, then pointed to Duke before gesturing toward his eyes and back up to the stairs. Duke nodded and aimed his rifle to the staircase. He fell to the back of the group to watch their back. Tony's rifle passed into the living room first, with Tech's shoulder at his back. Once he could see the two men within, he noticed they were playing cards at a small folding table and drinking beer. Their angle made it easier for their entry without being noticed at first. But once both of the boys were in the room, it was hard to hide. The men had weapons near them, but Tony and Tech were locked on their position.
Get up slowly. Do not speak.
The two men rose slowly, their hands coming up and over their heads. Tony gestured toward the front door and the men began moving toward it. Tony tilted his head to key the radio in an attempt to inform Wheeler that two men would be exiting in a minute. As he did, the man in the rear dove for Tony's rifle, shoving it against the wall. The boy instinctively fired, but the bullet buried into wood. He felt the man's fist punch him in the face as his body was shoved back into Tech. Tech could not shoot without harming Tony, and simply stumbled back. By this time, Duke had turned his attention to his friends and attempted to get a clear shot. Tony struggled with his adversary as the other man ran for the shotgun that rested by the table. Feet bound down the stairs, questioning the noise. Duke turned to shoot, but was tackled to the ground by the man who had come down. One of the man's hands pressed the rifle into Duke's chest, while the other drove his knuckles into his face. Tony was finally able to bring his knee up and push back the one that held him. His rifle snapped into place, and 3 shots were fired before the man could regain his balance. As that one dropped, Tony turned to the next, who was about to fire the shotgun. The boy pulled the trigger while dropping backward into the hall. The door frame was splintered by 5.56 rounds and buckshot simultaneously as Tony hit the floor. Duke blocked the next few punches with the butt of his rifle and attempted to shove the man off of him, but it was no use. He was too large. The body of his rifle began to bury into his neck, cutting off his air until Tech turned and dropped the end of his gun into the man's temple. The large figure crumpled to the floor, holding his head and cursing. Tony looked back as the man attempted to get up and screamed for Tech to shoot. His friend simply stared with his gun trained on the person.
I said shoot, God damn it!
At the sound of gunfire and screaming, Wheeler and Weasel forced their way in the front door. Weasel popped a couple of rounds into the man in the living room, who was injured but trying to get up from the floor. The man's body dropped limp after 1 bullet pierced his skull. Wheeler shoved Tech aside and fired 3 rounds at the final adversary, 2 hitting him in the chest and 1 in the neck. Blood sprayed across the hall and created a peppered painting on the wall.
Are you guys all right?
Weasel asked.
We're fine.
Tony said while gasping for air.
You get the girl out?
Yes, sir. She's with Overwatch.
Wheeler replied.
Good. Let's finish sweeping this house and get the hell out of here.
Duke nodded while adjusting his gear again, preparing to ascend the steps. They fell in line behind him, Tony taking up the rear. If there was anyone else inside, they would have to face all of them. When they reached the top step, they were greeted by several young children. They stood whimpering in doorways of bedrooms and staring at the stairway. The boys approached slowly, asking if there were any other adults inside. Some shook their head and others simply stared blankly while the group searched each room. After a short interview of some of the oldest children, the group learned that each one had been abducted, along with their parents, and had not seen either of them for weeks.
Night Stalker 1 to Overwatch.
Tony spoke into his radio transmitter.
This is Overwatch. Go ahead, Night Stalker 1.
Mission complete. We have 12 civilian miners that will need extraction.
10-4 Night Stalker 1. Extraction en route in 15.
Well, my friends, we've reached the end of tonight's chilling tale. After the Fall, Part 9, by the talented Locked 334. I hope you've enjoyed our descent into darkness, and that you'll carry a piece of the Fear File Chronicles with you as you drift into uneasy dreams. If our story left you shivering and shaking, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who crave a good scare, and subscribe to the Fear File Chronicles for more haunting horrors. Remember to hit the bell notification so you're always among the first to know when a new nightmare awaits. As always, we appreciate your support and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sharing your fears and frights with us truly means a lot, so don't be shy to engage with our sinister community. Until next time, remember to embrace the darkness, for it is within the shadows that our most terrifying stories are born. Good night, and stay scared.